Thanks everyone for tuning in to the documentary. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'm Richard Gosselin. I kind of produced and directed the documentary, I suppose, but obviously travelled with Euan from the Whisky team over to Spain to, tell the story of sherry cask maturation. And I understand some of you guys have got some questions that you wanted to put to Euan. Euan, thanks for taking the time to do this.
No worries.
First one from Alex Moores from the Society over in Australia. He's asking, what are the main considerations when it comes to deciding on a period of additional maturation in ex-sherry casks?
Generally our proposition is about creating variety and exploring, everything that whiskey can be. So generally you might be looking at a parcel of casks of, say, 50 different barrels or hogsheads. Could be filled on the same day into the same cask type, and what we'll do is look at how we can best diversify that parcel of casks. So we've got, as you'll see in the documentary, we've got great relationships with cooperages and bodegas in Jerez. So we're always looking at the next delivery of those casks and how best to utilize them, and to make sure that we're making as much variety as possible. That could be across all different ages, and we generally have a policy of we'll leave some as they are, we'll move some into new casks to create something new. Every cask is different, so there's an element of judgment there. Our general policy as well is to extra mature for at least 2 years, because we find that is the sweet spot for when the spirit's kind of relaxed and got to know its new home and taken a lot of the flavours. But we will also mature for much longer than that as well.
Very good. Jess Davis wants to know, can you talk about the difference between Bodega casks versus seasoned sherry casks and what difference that makes to the end result?
When we refer to a Bodega cask, it will mean that it's basically been retired from a Solera, so it could have been used for a number of decades really in a Solera. They can be quite difficult to work with, so we have to be very thorough and selective in the people that we work with for the supply of those. When you think about it, what the Bodega is looking for is a vessel that has very little activity in the wood, that will just let the wine sit for years and years on end and gain complexity. Depending on the style of wine, it will be from contact with oxygen, for example, with the likes of Oloroso. When you bring those over to fill with whiskey, it's kind of the opposite of what you want, because it can be really inactive and not give you much of a flavour contribution. They can also have been treated throughout their history with like sulphur candles and stuff like that, which can have a negative impact on the whiskey. Ex-Bodega casks can be brilliant, but you really have to be careful about who you work with and that you know the full cask history of those. The seasoned casks are much more consistent, and they're effectively an ode to the old transport sherry casks, when sherry used to be brought over to the UK in general to be bottled, and it was brought over in casks. Those casks were then used to mature Scotch whisky, and they tended to be fairly newly coopered casks that were just for shipping the sherry, so a lot more active wood influence, and that's kind of what the sherry season casks are an ode to. Now that all sherry must be bottled in Spain, those casks don't come over here anymore, but we can kind of recreate their impact through the seasoning of casks. Obviously as well, you've got great control over all sorts of different elements in terms of the oak species, the toasting level, the type of wine that you want filled into those casks, the winery that you want to manage that wine for you. So they're two different worlds. I wouldn't say one's better than the other, they're just very different. But certainly with the Bodega casks, you have to be quite cautious.
Very good. Up next is Ethan. He asks, what is your underrated sherry and any prediction for the next in thing for sherry casks?
I mean, I love sherry to enjoy a glass of wine, and it's quite a different experience to what's actually suitable for maturing whiskey in. So, I love a crisp cold fino before a meal, but I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the best type of wine for seasoning your casks. I actually think we'll see maybe a broadening of the sherry region to include some more wines or some more techniques, which would be quite interesting. The area of Montilla is where the majority of PX grapes are grown, and they make all the same styles of wine. They're just not within the sherry triangle. So I think we might see a bit of expansion into different wine producing areas to get similar but more kind of interesting diverse effects.
Very good. Marcus Zetter, he's asking, how do you determine which new makes work best in which types of sherry cask? Do heavier makes work in lighter casks, or is it the other way around?
In general, both work. My personal preference is if for like a heavier style whiskey, is if you've had it in contact with char in a bourbon cask, for example, for a number of years. It helps to clean up some of the rougher edges, but keeps the complexity that you get from such a style of spirit. And then you can really, take it in a few different directions. You'll see releases of a distillery 76 or 44, for example, heavier distillates. We'll release them in a variety of different casks. Of course, they only get bottled when the panel give them the nod. But yeah, generally, everything works as long as you're using quality wood, I would say.
Nice one. Laura Davidson is asking, have you experimented much with any spirit in the lesser seen sherry casks like ex-Fino, ex-Manzanilla? Is there any desirability in those different styles of sherry that we might not see as often as Oloroso and PX?
I think we will do a bit of experimentation in that area. We've got a very small collection of Amontillado casks in the warehouse, so excited to see how those develop. Generally, our preference is to use the oxidative styles, so the fortified, they're a bit stronger, more stable as wines, and they've also got quite a depth of flavour that can, really translates into the whiskey. I've tasted some really nice ex-Fino cask whiskies, but in general, it's a much lighter wine. You've got the floor, the kind of layer of live yeast that protects it from the oxygen. It's not necessarily preferable, I would say, to be transporting casks in, a lot of heat over a couple of weeks or whatever it takes to arrive here, when you've got that kind of residual stuff in the cask. So our preference is to use the oxidative wines because we think they give a richer impact to the whiskey, but they're also just a bit more stable, so they help ensure that consistency.
Very good. Tony Hill next. He is asking, how do you manage expected demand on sherry casks and forecast the demand for different spirit types? And does that vary between more mature whiskey markets and what you might think of as an emerging whiskey market, maybe more in Asia, I suppose?
We are aiming for 35% of our releases to be sherry influenced whiskies. We've got an extensive filling program where we're filling a large proportion into sherry as well. So over the next few years, we'll see more full-term sherry maturation coming through, but also we'll obviously continue with our additional maturation program as well. As a whiskey team, that's what we're looking at each year. So, you bottle 1,000 casks, roughly 350 of them are sherry influenced, and then how those are split up around the world, we're hoping that there'll be a kind of equal spread of those. So yes, it's a difficult thing to manage. I mean, we're laying down our own casks in Jerez 2 years prior to them being emptied of sherry and brought over to Scotland. So we've got that foresight to sort of make sure we've got the supply of the sherry wood that we think we're going to need as well to deliver that target.
Final question comes from Rob Mitchell. With the 50th anniversary of the SMWS in 10 years, just under 10 years' time, what do you envisage the SMWS will look like at that time? So not strictly speaking a sherry question, just a chance to get your crystal ball out, Euan.
Got one in my back pocket here. Yeah, well, I hope much like it is today, but obviously that we're able to share our whiskies with as wide a membership as possible. Who knows where whiskey will go in general, but we've seen throughout the years that we're open to all things whiskey and experimenting with like our small batches and things like that. So you may see new product types coming out, I would think. Yeah, it's difficult to say. One of the things I'm really excited about is, I just alluded to our fillings program there. So the oldest casks from that are probably about 9-10 years old at the moment. So in 10 years' time, we're going to see some lovely older whiskies that we've commissioned from day one into wood of our choosing. So that's super exciting.
Fantastic. That's all the questions. Thanks for your time, Euan, and I hope everyone there in Australia has had a good evening and learnt a wee bit more about the society and what the whisky team is up to. Thanks everyone, and thanks Euan for your time.
Cheers folks.